Doom for the Sega 32X. Now this is how you release a first-person shooter for an old-school home console. This is how a Sega console should handle a first-person shooter. Doom has great graphics, great sound effects, and just great gameplay. Nothing was lost when Doom was released for the 32X versus when Duke Nukem 3D was released for the Sega Genesis. Everything was lost. Duke Nukem 3D for the Sega Genesis, which I reviewed just a couple of days ago, was dreary and gray, had horrible frame rate, horrible graphics, horrible everything, horrible music. Nothing was good about that game. It was an absolute mess. It should not have been released. It was basically a really bad port. This game works for the 32X. Why? Well, the 32X can handle these graphics. It's as simple as that. If your game is being overly ambitious and the system is just not made for your game's graphics, it can't handle the technical capabilities, and you have to squeeze the game. You have to make the game into a WinRAR file. You have to make the game a small little zip file where everything is condensed. It's not an overly fair comparison. I mean, obviously the Sega Genesis, the Mega Drive, it's a 16-bit console. The Sega 32X, obviously a 32-bit console, but it's not a 32-bit console like the PlayStation 1. It's kind of in the middle. The Sega 32X never was able to compete with other 32-bit consoles like the PS1. It was far, far inferior. The Sega 32X was much closer to something like a Super Nintendo, even a Sega Genesis, than an actual 32-bit console. In fact, the graphics for Doom for the 32X are very similar to graphics of Doom for the Super Nintendo. On its own, without even comparing it to the travesty that was Duke Nukem 3D for the Sega Genesis Mega Drive, just by itself, even if we don't know first-person shooting games for old-school consoles exist, this is a good game just on its own. It has great movement, a lot of cool different weapons, cool enemies. Obviously when they're a little further away they're a little blurry, but even if they're like at a medium distance from you, you could already make the enemies out. The graphics in this game are really good, and so is the music. It's also a much easier game when compared to Duke Nukem 3D for the Sega Genesis, mostly because again, you can actually move your character like it's a game and not a pop-up book. Like the frame rate actually works for a game. This qualifies as a game, but also the enemies aren't overly insane. Like if you're playing on the medium difficulty, you can pass the game without like replaying every level a million times until you master the level, until you memorize every nook and cranny, until you memorize every single pixel on every wall and know exactly how the enemies are gonna move before they move. Without having to master the game, by just being fairly decent at old school first person shooters, you could actually pass this game. It's partly because you move well, because the enemies aren't overly hard, and also because there's just a lot of various health and armor power-ups all over the place. But honestly, health power-ups in a horrible game like Duke Nukem 3D for the Sega Genesis, they wouldn't even help you, because most of the time I died in that game, it was like from 1 or 2 hits. I would have no time to actually get to any kind of health power-up. That wouldn't be an option. The only way to pass that game on the first go would be to be lucky and clairvoyant. Doom on the 32X is just a smooth and fun experience. If you're into old school, mid to early 90s first-person shooters of this type, I mean, I definitely recommend it. It's one of the best. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more classic game reviews. Goodbye, my friends.